Well, of course, I knew of Mandela. You know, as all of us, we were very much involved in campaigns to try and have him freed all those years. When I went back in 1973, for instance, one of the missions I had was to meet with his wife, with Winnie Mandela, who was then under house arrest. It was one of those bad movie scenes where you meet on a street corner and she's disguised as somebody working as a servant in a house, and I can't remember what I was disguised as. I transmitted some money to her from abroad. So I felt an affinity and a closeness to the Mandela clan and to the Mandela family, and of course as a fellow prisoner. In fact, the first time I had contact, although it was not direct, was I was working in the general stores in a prison called Portsmouth in Cape Town, and he was brought back from the island on his way to another prison inland. And he had to be issued with new clothes, and I was involved in doing that. I had to prepare his clothes for him in the cell, and I remember how furious the warders were at any notion that he may be getting privileged treatment. You know, as they were saying, he's using a very pejorative term, racist term. He's a black like everybody else. Why should he be treated differently? And when he actually arrived the day in that particular prison complex,
in Portsmouth.
In Portsmouth, the security officer, a man called Duru, who is also very red-faced, walked into my cell, threw his cap on my bed and said, very angry, "I suppose you're happy now." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, your boss is here." So I knew that he'd arrived in prison. When he was released, we were actually in the country, and it was such a moment of absolute elation, such a moment of, you know, profound. It's not easy, I think, to describe to people that after all those many years, when that particular man, Nelson Mandela, came to incarnate and embody the dream of freedom and the dream of justice, and to see that man walking out, he was an old man already, and walking out holding his fist in the air with dignity and with courage, and already, as he walked out, in control of not only himself and his immediate environment, but of the situation. He was taken to Cape Town, and he made a speech from the balcony of the City Hall, which of course was again another powerful movement.
So he was held for 27 years. In 1973, when they caught him,
yes,
wasn't the information given of his whereabouts by the US CIA handed over to the South African authorities?
There's always been very, very close collaboration between the United States intelligence agencies and, of course, diplomatic services and the apartheid regime. I remember in the would have been at the end of the 1980s, when I was here in this country for the first time for a PEN International Conference, meeting with a man called Elliot Abrams in the offices of the New Republic at that time, and we had a flaming argument about South African policies. At that time, they were promoting something called constructive engagement, I think. And of course, my brother's own adventures in Angola, he'd be able to tell you the extent of CIA and American support they had. Whether Mandela was actually shopped by CIA information or not, I'm not sure.
So he comes out of prison on February 11th, 1990, a moment all in South Africa and around the world will never forget. And what then, how is the plan laid out for a new South Africa? The election, the multi-racial, multi-party election doesn't take place for another 4 years.
Yes.
We talked to Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu came in the other day, the South African Archbishop. He voted for the first time in 1994 at the age of 63.
It was also the first time I voted in a South African election, at least. In the meantime, I had obtained French citizenship, so I had voted in France, but it was the first time I voted in my country of origin. I think part of the problems that we see at the moment in South Africa probably can be traced back to that period and to that process. Mandela had probably been, well, not probably, we know that he had been not negotiating, but he had been having talks with South African authorities for quite a while. The contact between Mandela and the people with him in prison, his closest comrades, people like Walter Sisulu and Governor Mbeki and others, and the outside wing of the ANC and the outside underground of the ANC was a very difficult thing. So one had the coming about of a de facto three components of the African National Congress, what we call the insiles, or the prison people, the leaders, the historic leaders. The internal underground was grouped under an umbrella organization called the United Democratic Front, led by people like Desmond Tutu and Boesak and others, and of course the exile organization, which was the official African National Congress, led by Oliver Tambo. And I think that although there probably was certainly we all believed in the same objectives, the way of going about it, and perhaps even to some extent the ultimate goals of what this struggle was for, was not necessarily shared by everybody. I think Mandela and the people around him, and certainly with the agreement of all the senior people in the ANC, decided that the situation could only be negotiated to work towards a national government or a government of national coalition, which is how we had for the first few years even de Klerk and some of his National Party ministers, who were the architects and the defenders of apartheid in the new liberation government. When de Klerk and the others then left, and Mandela was, after a while, when he resigned, or at least when he came to the end of his first mandate, and Thabo Mbeki took over, I think there was a new turn in the history of South Africa. I think the breakout we see at the moment within the ANC, for instance, can partly be understood in terms of I would say nearly to some extent competing traditions. The internal wing was really the people who were responsible for bringing apartheid to an end. The outside ANC was far more of an ideological organization and probably far more attuned to international affairs and to international alliances. The fact of the demise of the Soviet Union around about the time at the beginning of the 80s, when the ANC came to power, probably accounts to some extent for a strategic choice that was made and that we're getting to rue now. And the strategic choice was, to some extent, the abandonment of the Freedom Charter, which was essentially a socialist document, and opting for a free market economic system, so as to be able to secure the interest, the financial interest in investments of the South African governing class, economic class, and of course of the outside community. I remember the South African ambassador in Washington telling me that when our people came up in a first period, the State Department and the Treasury people would insist that they wear ties and they don't address one another as comrade. This is no longer allowed.